All right, let's unpack the deadlift with our coach's eye. First thing we have in the progression is that stance. Now, our stance, like we said before, is going to be between our jumping stance and our landing stance. And this is going to be dependent upon the anatomy of the athlete. So depending on how long their legs are, how long the legs in relation to the torso are, so not just the length of the legs, but it's more like the overall anatomy, how long the shins are in relation to the femur. Lots of stuff are going on here, but a good general stance is you get them to their jumping stance, have them take a slightly wider stance there. So your eyes go to the feet, you kind of look at the overall position, and you might actually have to adjust them a few times throughout their setups to see if this is the right position for them. And the way you do that is you then move on in the progression. So you're like, that looks pretty close to that place for me. Okay, so let's go ahead and take the bar down to the middle of the shin. And then we look at the foot position and we go, okay, foot position, we want relatively straight or slightly toed out. He's got his left foot a little turned in. Can you turn that? Yeah, there we go, good. And go ahead and stand on up. So with the foot position in the deadlift, you can actually have a slightly straighter toe because you're not going at a full flexion of the hip like you would in an air squat. So you can get a little bit more torque from the hips if you have a straighter foot, and because you're not going all the way at the flex, you can actually have a slightly straighter toe here. But you can also turn out just a little bit, and for some people that is appropriate. So our eyes go on that feet, making sure our toe position is not way turned in or way turned out. From there, we go down to the middle of the shin. Take it to like right here. Putting some plates there. Good, cool. And then we look at making sure the knees tracking the toe. Oddly enough, we'll have people get to this position and be lazy with the knees, and they'll let the knees cave. So your eyes have to, yeah, they'll get down, they'll be like, is this my deadlift? And you're like, no, man, go ahead and stand on back up. I usually like to make a joke because usually when you're teaching the deadlifts, it's a little bit longer into their learning career, and you'll say, hey, at what point in time in our sessions do we let the knee really cave in? And they'll be like, and it'll be like, trick question, never. So please push your knee out. And then there'll be this big driving in the knee out. So they get down to that bottom position. We make sure the knees lift pushing out. The only place that this can go wrong is if they push their knees too far out, and that's extreme. And he's actually really flexing through that ankle. Usually when people push their knees that far out, their feet will start to lift. So they'll start to go out and that heel starts to lift up. We don't want that. We want something a little bit more moderate than that. Yeah, go ahead and stand. The next thing that we want to look at after we look at that knee angle and making sure that's good, full foot's on the ground, we're grabbing our toes to the ground and creating a nice arch in the foot, is making sure that the grip accommodates the knees. So the grip we didn't go over until now, because when we go down to the bottom, we get all this other setup going, we push the knees out, we want to make sure that the grip's not getting in the way of the knees, which might mean they need to take either a narrower stance or a wider grip. And that's dependent upon the athlete that you're working with. And that's the two ways that you can start to begin to accommodate these knees, is that slightly narrower stance or that slightly wider grip, or a combination of the two. Go ahead and stand. And that's a time as a coach where you might be there and be like, that first stance I put them in, it's not quite there, go a little narrower, or widen your grip up. Whatever it is, you get to make those adjustments, hence the reason we do a progression. So then you get them down there, they got that nice wide grip, or the grip that's gonna accommodate the knees. The stance is looking good, eyes are all going here. Now we have to talk about an active shoulder. And the active shoulder, my favorite thing to do for this is just to understand, try to pull it away and get in here and force them to use their lat to pull it into their body. Go ahead and stand. When people are learning to deadlift, they should be scraping their knees, their shins up to some degree, because they're imprecise with how they can keep that. Once people become more proficient, then it's easier to keep it tight and not actually scrape up your body. But you should lose some skin when you're first learning here. And we'd rather have that than the bar drifting away from your body. Oftentimes people make this artificial, and they'll come down and they'll tap in here and be like, pinch this back, and that's just not a real thing. We just want to, we want to avoid being pulled out of position. And the way we do that is kind of come in, give a little handle there. The one thing I would say with that cue is if you're doing this, don't leave your hand here. So as they stand up, because then you're going to touch their genitals, and that becomes weird for everybody involved.
Rule number 2 of coaching, don't be creepy.
Yeah, rule number 2 of coaching was don't be creepy. So avoid that one at all costs. But get them to understand that pull it in tight to the body. The tactile is really good. You could also just say, hey, bend the bar around your shins. That's a verbal cue for doing the same thing. After we get that nice active shoulder, we now need to talk about the last piece before we lift, which is making sure that the back is nice and rigid before we go. And how we do that is flexing our abs against our erectors to prevent the spine from rounding. So we have to say, hey, I want you to brace like you're gonna be hit, make sure that's happening in the very bottom position. And you can also even think about extending through the chest if you can. So go ahead and get down to the bottom. And you think about, hey, make sure you're braced through there and then lifting the chest up nice and tight. And it should be uncomfortably so. And we talked about this before, but Jason's got a little bit of kyphosis through his mid back here. So it's a little bit rounded naturally. Go ahead and stand. And it gets exacerbated when he gets down to that bottom position. But for some people, that'll be extra flat. For some people, there might be a little hunch there. Did you go to Notre Dame? Like, no, there was a Hunchback of Notre Dame joke in there. I thought this symbol was. Isn't that the Notre Dame symbol?
I do remember when Navy beat Notre Dame, though.
Navy beat. Okay, there it is.
One
Okay,
time
I was
in the past
just
40 years, but
say,
whatever.
you bring some bells.
It's not
in
a
there.
sore spot, but
So just watch that. You got to get that back nice and flat, and we got to get that flat before we lift. Occasionally, you can see somebody overextend, where they're like pop it way out. Ideally, that doesn't happen. But if that's the case, have them flex those abs harder, because when you're flexing your abs, you can't, unless you let go of the abs, you can't keep turning the hips over. So we got to get that flat back before they lift. Then we talk about the actual line of action, how they get it off the ground. And my thought process for this is I want them to think about pushing their knees back and lifting their chest, not one or the other. It's just to drive the knees back, lift the chest, drive the knees back, lift the chest, and then stop above the knees. So go down to the bottom, they get all those other points, and then you say, okay, when I say stand, I want you to push your knees back and lift your chest at the same time. And stand, drive your knees back, lift the chest, stop. And you have them stop right above the knee. Now here, a lot of people will still have their knees way bent, and you'll be like, push your knees back, push your knees back, push your knees back, right there. That's where I want you to get to, okay? And now stand all the way up. So from here, we have to talk about the descent. The descent, we'll just have them start nice and tall, chest tall. In this position, just think push the butt back towards the back wall, slide it down to the top of the knee and stop. And be like, do you recognize this position? This is where you just were. From here, just drop straight down to the bottom of that deadlift. Cool. Go ahead and stand and relax. There's actually a lot of coaches who teach from the top down. They just teach the deadlift from the top down because it's a really easy way to get someone set into that position and be like, okay, now let's find this. I personally have a much easier time, not easier time, I find more long-term success from teaching it from the bottom up, because that's how you deadlift. You don't walk up to a heavy load and go, let me grab it at the top here, set myself and go down. And if you can communicate it through the process I just said, then they have a really easy time lowering it and they maintain that a bit better.
The other thing that'll happen if you teach from the top down, practically speaking, is what the coach will typically lack in that teaching session is enough reps in the setup. So when you start from the bottom up, you get way more reps in the setup to see hip height, shoulder relationship to the bar. Not that teaching from the top down is a bad thing. You should know how to do both. But what I typically see is when they teach from the top down, we get way fewer reps in the setup, and we know that most things, if they're wrong in the setup, will affect everything else moving forward.
Totally. That's a good thing. I actually never thought about it that way, but yeah, that's another reason that we would really want to make sure. I like personally teaching from the bottom up, because then when you teach the bottom down or the top down, you get them set to that position and they're like, oh, and then everything else they were doing before like clicks, and they're like, ah, that's a great way to do it, which is right there. From there, you have to just revisit back with your eye that line of action, because we only went over it once before we kind of addressed the top, because they got there. So since they were there, we might as well teach that descent. But then you say, hey, we're not going to stop now at the top of the knee. We're just going to have you be lifting. And then you go back and you stand from the side and you go back to making sure that their knees are going back and their chest is going up at the same time. Now, how this usually goes wrong is people will either rip just their chest up and go out and around the knee, in which case you'll give a cue like, hey, push the knees back and out of the way as you stand. Or they'll get a little dancery with it and they'll shoot their hips and then rip it all the way up. In which case you say, hey, lead with your chest a little bit more, and usually swinging on either sides of that pendulum will get them somewhere in between. But you do that after you teach the descent, because then you can get a few reps where they're moving through the full movement and your eyes are going to, hey, how's that bar navigating the knee with all of the other stuff being correct? Now you're still looking at all those other points that you taught, but then you can focus on the dynamic portion of the movement and really cue to that place. That's our progression for the dead. Good luck.
Thank you for watching, and if you found that helpful and you want more of this kind of content, we have literally hundreds of videos just like this, from practical tips and tricks to theory to everything in between, all in the knowledge. And if you want to learn from me directly and our cohort of level 4 staff members, then we also have the Knowledge Pro, which we do weekly calls and live interaction and homework and everything else in between. If you want any more information or would like to have a free trial of the knowledge, please click the link in the description below and get after it.